By the time anyone realized something was wrong, a life had already been lost. Robert Williams' case. A quiet crime. Fargo Series, Part 4. Some crimes do not arrive with sirens or headlines. They happen quietly, between people who know each other, in places that feel ordinary. In Fargo, cases like this rarely demand attention, yet their consequences remain long after the city moves on. Not every crime changes a city or leaves a visible mark on its streets. Some pass through unnoticed, never becoming part of public memory or national conversation. But for those closest to the loss, life never returns to what it was before. This is not a story that made national news or sparked public debate. It is a documented case from Fargo, shaped by familiarity rather than spectacle. A life was lost, and a quiet process of justice followed. Fargo is not a city that often appears in national headlines. Crimes here rarely arrive with urgency or spectacle, and when violence occurs, it often does so quietly. Behind closed doors, within familiar streets, life-changing events can unfold without ever demanding public attention. Because of this, some cases never become widely known. They are reported briefly, documented carefully, and then gradually disappear from public conversation. But the absence of attention does not lessen the weight of what happened, nor does it reduce the permanence of the loss left behind. The Robert Williams case was one of those stories. There were no dramatic press conferences and no extended media coverage. There were no viral moments that forced the case into the national spotlight. Instead, the events unfolded within the boundaries of Fargo itself, affecting only those directly involved and permanently altering their lives. This was not a crime committed by a stranger passing through. It did not happen in a moment of public chaos or random violence. It was an act of harm between people who knew one another, carried out in a setting that was neither unusual nor visibly dangerous. For most of Fargo, daily life continued uninterrupted. People went to work, routines remained unchanged, and the city maintained its quiet rhythm. But for one family, that normalcy ended entirely, replaced by a silence that would never fully lift. This episode does not attempt to dramatize what happened, nor does it seek to explain it through speculation or psychological theory. It follows the documented facts of a single case and the legal process that followed. By tracing what occurred, how the investigation unfolded, and how the justice system responded, this story reveals how serious consequences can emerge from crimes that never make headlines. Because some cases are not remembered for their noise, they are remembered for the lives they permanently changed. Before the case became a file number in Cass County records, the victim was living an ordinary life in the Fargo area. She was not known to the public, and there was nothing about her daily routine that suggested her life would become the subject of a criminal investigation. Like many people in Fargo, her world was shaped by familiar places, known faces, and routines that felt stable and predictable. Those who knew her described her as someone who maintained close connections within her personal circle. Her relationships were rooted in familiarity rather than chance, and her interactions with others followed patterns built over time. She lived within a network of people she trusted, moving through spaces that felt safe precisely because they were known. She was an adult woman whose life was structured around everyday responsibilities rather than public presence. Her days followed a familiar rhythm shaped by work, personal obligations, and relationships within her immediate environment. Nothing about her circumstances suggested instability or exposure to extraordinary risk in the moments leading up to the crime. Robert Williams was part of that known world. Their connection was not sleuthshy, nor was it formed in the moments immediately preceding the crime. They had an established relationship, one that placed them in each other's presence through prior contact rather than coincidence. There was no public indication that her life was under immediate threat. No warnings were issued, and no extraordinary measures were taken to protect her safety. From the outside, nothing suggested that an encounter with someone she already knew would end in irreversible violence. In cases like this, the absence of visible danger is often what makes the outcome so difficult to comprehend. The setting was not unfamiliar, and the people involved were not strangers. This was a situation shaped by proximity and trust rather than randomness. By the time authorities would later reconstruct her final hours, it became clear that the crime did not interrupt a life lived on the margins. It cut through the center of an ordinary existence, and that reality would become one of the most difficult aspects for her family to confront as the case moved forward. It was someone she knew. It was personal. It was a betrayal. The events that led to the victim's death unfolded within a narrow window of time, in a setting that did not immediately signal danger. There was no public disturbance, no sudden escalation that drew outside attention, and no immediate witnesses who could intervene. What occurred took place quietly, away from public view, shaped by a personal interaction rather than a random encounter. The incident occurred in the Fargo area in the late evening hours, during a period when daily activity had largely slowed. The timing placed the events away from public visibility, at a point when most people had returned home and the surrounding environment had grown quiet. This limited time frame would later become important in reconstructing the sequence of events and determining who had access to the victim during those final hours. On the day of the incident, the victim and Robert Williams were in contact with one another. This contact was not unusual in itself, nor did it immediately raise concern among those who later reviewed the timeline. The interaction placed them together in a private or semi-private environment where no external presence disrupted what followed. At some point during that encounter, the situation turned violent. According to investigative findings, the use of physical force resulted in injuries that proved fatal. The nature of the violence was direct and confined to the moment, rather than prolonged or repetitive, indicating a single episode rather than an extended series of actions. There were no indications of outside involvement. No evidence suggested that another individual entered the scene or contributed to what occurred. The circumstances, as later reconstructed by investigators, pointed to a clear connection between the people present and the outcome that followed. Emergency response did not arrive in time to prevent the loss of life. By the time authorities became aware of the situation, the victim had already suffered injuries that could not be reversed. Medical findings would later confirm that death resulted from the violence inflicted during that encounter. What made the event particularly difficult to process was its simplicity. There was no complex sequence of locations and no extended timeline spanning multiple days. The crime occurred within a limited space and time, leaving investigators to focus not on where the victim went, but on what happened between two people who already knew each other. This moment would become the central point around which the entire case turned. Every step of the investigation, every legal argument, and every decision made in court would trace back to these few hours. Understanding what happened during that time would be essential to determining responsibility and accountability. Concern arose when the victim could not be reached and her absence began to register as unusual to those close to her. This lack of contact prompted further action, leading to authorities being notified and the situation being formally assessed. What initially appeared as a welfare concern would quickly be recognized as something far more serious. Once authorities were notified, the case was treated as a criminal investigation rather than a medical emergency or unexplained death. Law enforcement in the Fargo area moved to secure the scene and begin documenting the circumstances surrounding the victim's injuries. From the outset, the focus was on establishing a clear and uninterrupted timeline of events. Investigators began by examining the location where the incident occurred. The environment showed no signs of forced entry or the presence of unknown individuals, reinforcing the understanding that the interaction had taken place between people who already knew one another. Physical evidence collected at the scene would later become central to linking the violence directly to the suspect. Attention quickly turned to the victim's last known contacts. Detectives reviewed phone records, messages, and recent interactions in order to determine who had been with her in the hours leading up to her death. Through this process, Robert Williams emerged as a key figure in the timeline, not through speculation, but through documented contact. As investigators interviewed individuals within the victim's circle, the picture remained consistent. There were no reports of unfamiliar visitors, no conflicting accounts that suggested an alternative sequence of events, and no evidence pointing to an unknown assailant. The case did not branch outward. Instead, it narrowed steadily toward a single individual. Williams was formally questioned as part of the investigation. During this stage, detectives compared his statements with the physical evidence in the established timeline. Any inconsistencies were evaluated against documented facts rather than assumptions or character judgments. Forensic findings played a crucial role in reinforcing the direction of the case. Medical reports confirmed that the victim's injuries were consistent with the use of force described by investigators. These findings aligned with the location, the timing, and the absence of any alternative explanation for the cause of death. As the investigation progressed, the focus shifted from determining what had happened to establishing legal responsibility. By this point, authorities were no longer working with multiple theories. The evidence pointed in a single direction, allowing prosecutors to begin preparing formal charges based on a clear and supported narrative. As the investigation narrowed, responsibility became less a matter of theory and more a matter of documented fact. The evidence collected did not point toward a complex network of suspects or an unknown intruder. Instead, it consistently returned to one individual whose presence, actions, and connection to the victim were clearly established. Robert Williams was not identified through assumption or reputation. He was identified through timelines, confirmed contact, and physical findings that aligned with the events under investigation. Each piece of evidence reinforced the same conclusion, reducing uncertainty rather than expanding it. Prosecutors focused on the direct relationship between Williams and the victim. This was not a case built on circumstantial distance or indirect involvement. The connection was immediate, personal, and supported by records that placed them together during the critical period. Statements given during questioning were evaluated alongside forensic results rather than in isolation. Investigators compared what was said with what could be independently verified, allowing inconsistencies to be addressed through evidence rather than interpretation. This approach ensured that the case remained grounded in fact rather than narrative. No alternative suspect emerged as the investigation progressed. There were no credible indications that another individual had been present or had intervened. The absence of competing explanations further solidified the case against Williams. By the time charges were formally pursued, responsibility was no longer framed as a question. It was presented as a conclusion supported by a clear chain of evidence. The role of the court would not be to determine whether a crime had occurred, but to decide how the law would respond to it. With the investigation complete and charges filed, the case moved into the formal structure of the legal system. Proceedings took place within the Cass County Court, where the focus shifted from reconstruction to accountability. From this point forward, every detail would be examined through the framework of criminal law rather than investigative theory. Prosecutors presented a case built on a clear sequence of events. They outlined the established relationship between Robert Williams and the victim, the timeline that placed them together, and the forensic evidence that connected the injuries directly to the encounter. Rather than relying on emotional appeal, the case centered on documented facts and consistency across multiple sources. The defense addressed the charges through legal argument rather than alternative narratives of responsibility. There was no competing version of events that introduced another suspect or fundamentally altered the timeline. Instead, the court's attention remained on how the actions in question met the legal standards required for conviction. As testimony and evidence were reviewed, the central issues became increasingly defined. The court was asked to determine intent, responsibility, and the degree to which the violence constituted a criminal offense under state law. These decisions rested on how the evidence aligned with statutory definitions, not on speculation about motive or character. After deliberation, the court reached its verdict. Robert Williams was found guilty of the charges brought against him, formally establishing legal responsibility for the victim's death. The conviction marked the end of uncertainty regarding who would be held accountable for the crime. Sentencing followed as a separate and consequential phase. The court considered the severity of the offense, the impact on the victim and her family, and the requirements set by law. A term of incarceration was imposed, reflecting both punishment and the legal conclusion of the case. The sentence reflected the court's determination of the severity of the offense under state law. It established a defined period of incarceration, setting clear limits on Robert Williams's freedom and formally closing the case within the justice system. While the legal outcome was decisive, it marked only one form of resolution in a process shaped by lasting loss. With the sentence handed down, the judicial process came to a close. For the legal system, the case was resolved through procedure and judgment. For those affected by the loss, the conclusion marked an end to proceedings, but not an end to the consequences that followed. After the court proceedings ended and the sentence was imposed, life in Fargo returned to its familiar rhythm. There were no ongoing press briefings, no prolonged public debate, and no visible reminders of the case in daily conversation. For the city as a whole, the conclusion of the trial marked a quiet return to normalcy. For the victim's family, however, the end of the legal process did not bring closure in the same way. The absence left behind by her death was not resolved by a verdict or defined by a sentence length. What remained was the permanent disruption of a life that had once been ordinary and uninterrupted. Cases like this rarely change how a city sees itself. They do not alter crime statistics in a way that attracts national attention, nor do they reshape public perception overnight. Instead, they exist as private tragedies, known fully only to those closest to them. The Robert Williams case did not become a defining moment for Fargo. It did not redefine the community or prompt widespread reflection about safety or identity. And yet, it remains a reminder that serious violence does not require spectacle to cause irreversible harm. What happened here was not extraordinary in its setting or execution. It was rooted in familiarity, proximity, and a breakdown that occurred between people who knew one another. That reality is what makes the case both difficult to categorize and impossible to dismiss. The legal system completed its role by establishing responsibility and imposing punishment. In doing so, it provided a formal conclusion to the events that led to the victim's death. But the effects of the crime extend beyond the courtroom, carried forward by those who must live with its outcome. This is why cases like this matter, even when they pass quietly through the system. They show how lives can be permanently altered without warning and without public attention. And they remind us that some stories do not echo because they are loud, but because they are real. The Robert Williams case did not change Fargo as a city. There were no lasting headlines and no public reckoning that followed. Life moved forward quietly and without disruption. But for those closest to the loss, nothing ever returned to what it was before. This case remains a reminder that violence does not need spectacle to cause permanent damage. Some stories fade from public memory, yet their echoes remain. Next on True Echoes. The next story is known as The Girl in the Garden, also referred to as the child buried by her adoptive father. It is a case that resurfaced in the United States in the fall of 2024, drawing renewed attention through several true crime programs. At the center of this story is a child and a home that was meant to offer protection. What remained hidden for years was not uncovered by chance, but through the slow and deliberate work of investigators confronting what had been buried. In the next episode, we follow the facts of a case that forces one unsettling question to the surface. How does a crime remain hidden for so long when it happened in plain sight? The truth coming soon on True Echoes. Some crimes pass through the justice system almost unnoticed, yet their consequences continue to echo, carried by the people left behind. What part of this case stayed with you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments, and let's talk. And step into the echoes of truth. To be continued.